Good afternoon. My name is Suzanne Nossel, and I'm an executive director of PEN American Center. On Monday, we were contacted with a message from Liu Jia. Liu Jia is a published poet in China. She's also the wife of Liu Xiaobo. He's the former president of the independent Chinese PEN Center. He's also the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. The prize was presented to an empty chair while he sat in jail, where he still sits today. From the time her husband won the prize, Liu Jia has been kept under strict house arrest. She's held virtually incommunicado, is allowed almost no visitors, and is almost always alone. This week, she asked for our help to convey 3 requests to her government: that she be allowed to write and to receive letters from her husband, that she be allowed to earn a living, and that she be allowed to see a doctor. She's had none of those privileges for the last 3 years. So we've written to Vice President Biden and asked him to raise Liu Jia and Liu Xiaobo's confinement while he's in Beijing today. And we hope anyone else here who may have the Vice President's ear or know someone on his plane might urge the same. That kind of request, conveyed both publicly and privately, is at the core of what PEN does. We mobilize writers to stand with other writers who are jailed, detained, or persecuted because of their ideas. Nearly half of PEN's cases of threatened writers worldwide involve individuals targeted for online and digital communications, for blog posts, emails, and social media. We're becoming a digital freedom organization because in 2013, an organization to protect the free speech of writers has no choice but to be a digital freedom organization. When I joined PEN last February, I asked one of our trustees why he got involved. He said it was because he thought American writers and journalists who enjoy the strongest safeguards for free speech in the world had an obligation to stand with colleagues abroad who suffer for what we do freely. That resonated with me after 2 stints in the U.S. government representing the United States on human rights issues. As a U.S. official, we proudly trumpeted our First Amendment as the world's most protective standard for free speech. We were the natural global leader on free expression, or so we thought. Within a few months at PEN, though, new revelations on the scope of NSA surveillance forced us to train a lens inward. We did a survey last month of PEN members that showed that 25% of American writers are censoring their communications, research, or writing for fear of triggering NSA scrutiny. We can, and I know we will, debate whether writers are right to be afraid. But the fact that some are afraid ought to make all of us a little bit afraid. Afraid of what we may not read, hear, or think if writers here in our own country feel constrained from communicating with certain people or covering certain topics. Yesterday, the editor of The Guardian was questioned in the British Parliament about his newspaper's decision to publish revelations from Edward Snowden. He talked about how UK and US intelligence officials have visited his newspaper. They've come 100 times just in the last few months. They've imposed prior restraints on what can be published. They've threatened journalists with prosecution. They've destroyed hard drives with power tools. After many questions about all of that, the editor was taken aback when an MP asked whether or not he loved his country. He said yes, that he loved his country, including its democracy and its free speech. I think that's how most PEN American writers feel. They love this country. They're proud of the protections that they enjoy. They're thankful that we haven't allowed hammers in newsrooms. And they're also ready to take a stand if they think those protections are at risk. That's why we're so thrilled to be here in Washington today with 4 such distinguished writers. I think of writers as the uber users of free speech, those who depend on it for their livelihood and their craft. They speak their minds, and we won't all agree, but they all cherish the freedom to speak and to be heard, including to be heard in the halls of power. This is an important discussion at an important time, and writers are a crucial part of it. We're grateful to Google, The Atlantic, to E.L. Doctorow, and Masha Gessen, and Azar Nafisi, and David Simon, and to our moderator, James Fallows, for making it all possible. And we welcome our audience here in the room, online, and around the world. Thank you. I want to introduce now Ross Lejeunesse, the Global Head of Internet Freedom and International Policy for Google.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. Google is really pleased to be partnering with PEN and with The Atlantic today. As Suzanne mentioned, PEN has been fighting for free expression long before there was an internet and long before there was a Google. At Google, we care about a free and open internet because we believe it's the right thing for our users who demand access to the information they want. We believe it's the right thing to do for the internet itself, which was designed to be free and open from its very inception. And we fight for a free and open internet because we know it's the right thing for society. Many people believe that any internet will do, but it's only the free and open internet that provides for the economic development and the social advancement and societal understanding and advancement that allows creativity and the free exchange of ideas to occur. It's my privilege now to introduce James Fallows, the award-winning author and national correspondent of The Atlantic, who will moderate today's discussion. Thanks very much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Suzanne. As you heard, I'm James Fallows from The Atlantic. It's a real privilege and honor for me to be here, partly because of the institution sponsoring this event, Google, PEN, the museum, which is our host, and my parent institution of The Atlantic. They're all ones I respect and have. And there are 4 writers, all of whose work I have learned from over the years, but none of whom I have met before this day. So I'm really excited for a chance to draw them out. We're dealing with a topic whose implications are so vast we could spend many, many days discussing them, but I'm going to try to focus on some of the implications that each of these writers has examined in his or her work and see where we agree and disagree. Before going into the topic itself, I'll say a word or two about each of our panelists. This is literally the needs no introduction panel, but nonetheless, I'm going to say, starting from my left, we have E.L. Doctorow, who you know as one of America's leading figures of letters. If I read the list of his novels, it would take the rest of the time, starting with Welcome to Hard Times, The Book of Daniel, on through Ragtime and like Bathgate, The Waterworks, forthcoming Andrew's Brain. Every award you can think of, an honor in our national letters he has received, so we're very glad to have E.L. Doctorow here. Next to him is Azar Nafisi, who was born in Persia, lived there, came to the United States in 1997, has been a U.S. citizen for the past 5 years, is known to the world probably best for her novel Reading Lolita in Tehran, which was on the bestseller list for 117 weeks. She's written a number of other books and has the forthcoming Republic of Imagination about the United States as a Republic of Letters, which will come out next year. Next to her is Masha Gessen, who is an admired Russian and American author, journalist, intellectual. Born in Moscow, lives there again, was in the U.S. in intervening years, has books Half a Revolution, Blood Matters, Perfect Rigor, The Man Without a Face about Vladimir Putin, and the forthcoming one about Pussy Riot called Words Will Break Cement. She publishes regularly in Slate, the New York Times, and elsewhere. Finally, David Simon, whom you may know from his work as a Baltimore Sun, a reporter, as a chronicler of modern America through his TV productions, ranging from Homicide, The Wire, Generation Kill, Treme, and MacArthur Fellowship Award winner. When we were living in China, we got DVDs of The Wire. I'll confess we only paid 60 cents for each season, but we couldn't get legit ones. And we'd bring our Chinese friends over and say, this is the real America you should see. So it is an honor to have panelists and writers like these talk about the climate of information, free speech, the ability to both produce, consume, and convey information about our world. We know that in all parts of the world landscape, there are different sorts of challenges to the generation of information, the ability to find what you want, the ability to agree on common truths. In the United States, there is the technological disclosures of the last 6 months involving the NSA, what things are known, what things are not known, the longer running problem of the economics of journalism, what kind of information we'll be able to find. In Russia and Iran, there are their own problems of a governmental policy. I've spent much of the recent years in China, where, of course, all issues of free expression are at stake. I will say this was not evoked by our sponsors, but I will always admire Google for the stand it took in China. It was at great cost to them within China, but it was standing up for a principle. We know that there are many other questions of the culture of journalism, possibilities of self-censorship. The poll you heard from Suzanne Nossel of many PEN members feeling as if they were changing their behavior for fear of surveillance. The way I would like to start this discussion is by asking each of these 4 world-famous storytellers to tell a story about his or her own experience with free speech, the ways in which it is encouraged, the ways it is coming into question. And I will kick this off with a very banal, brief 2 stories of my own. The first involves digital data. I may be less surprised and less alarmed than many other people by the revelations of surveillance because from day one I have assumed that anything in digital form would be seen by somebody. So my friends will and my family will report, I never put anything in email I don't think that I would be embarrassed if somebody else saw it. I just figure it is by definition insecure, so I talk to people in person. The other is you heard Suzanne talk about the situation of Liu Shan in China. During the years I was living in China, I felt as if my own freedom of expression wasn't really jeopardized by self-censorship because I thought the worst thing that could happen to me as an American is that I would have to leave or that I wouldn't get a visa. But I knew that for people in China, it was an entirely different situation with entirely different stakes. And so I have been less affected by free speech controversies than many people because I've always mistrusted email and I had this situation in China. But let me start with E.L. Doctorow. You've written about many episodes in American history where surveillance, free speech were at stake. What is the story with which you'd like to introduce this topic to us?
Well, I've never censored myself, so far as I know. But the real question is that this is happening. And you have to think that these are writers who are denying themselves words, ideas, research. Their whole life is being made fearful. So now this country has a lot of problems, as we all know. There's that unfortunate lying war that we got into, the enormous poverty, the accretion of wealth in a very small percentage of the population, the numbers of people in prison are enough to populate a small country, poverty. But there's one thing that's been inviolable, and that has been the First Amendment, right of free speech, practice of religion, the right to petition the government in cases of injustice. Now, what is going on here is an act of self-censorship on the part of the people who supply the toxins to cleanse the society. And if they anticipate in acts of their own a larger censorship as coming from the government, then I think we're in real trouble. I think of the PEN members who've done this, testified to their self-censorship. I think of them as the canaries in the coal mine. You all know about the canaries in the coal mine who have always been put there to detect before humans can the carbon monoxide. And what happens to the canaries, they drop over dead, and then all the miners run out of the mine. I think this is the function of these sentinels to warn us that something really dark is happening. I don't think the words privacy or even free expression can approach the magnitude of the problem, which you mentioned China. I think there's the end of it. The idea of a society in which the First Amendment is gone, And there are all these inhibitions and restrictions upon the free writing of an imagination. So, I regard this as a very, very, really disastrous thing that the NSA is doing, of course, without accountability, and which does repeat the tendency of all police organizations to break the laws they're supposed to defend. And I imagine we will remember what J. Edgar Hoover's FBI did in the 1960s with rather primitive equipment. And now the technology is such that basically it's a vast system for dehumanizing people and turning citizens into subjects. So I don't share your optimism.
I was being containedly optimistic, but yes, I'm going to. The logic here is I'm going to start with our two mainly American practitioners and then add an international perspective. I want to ask David Simon, in addition to whatever other story you would like to tell, you have written in a very interesting way about the way in which the current NSA controversy you view it as an extension of a previous war within American society. And tell me, could you explain the analogies you made there?
Well, I covered a lot of telephonic intercepts. I covered the drug war. And this is all rooted in, I realize we're here to discuss the First Amendment, which I hold as sacrosanct as anyone. But actually, the real battleground in the NSA issue is the Fourth Amendment. And there is an entire history of legal precedent that says that certain things are not protected and do not have privacy rights. And there's almost, to me, an astonishing moment of, it's Claude Rains in Casablanca finding out that there was gambling going on at Rick's. You do not, going back to 1979, for any class of crime, not just drugs, rape, murder, robbery, assault, your phone records, your financial records, at a certain point, which is the point being a court order, and a very routine court order at that, these things can be investigated. The First Amendment does not guarantee anyone the right not to be investigated by a police officer or a law enforcement official who doesn't have the barest minimum of reason to believe that he might discover something relevant to law enforcement. These things are just true. And what bothers me about the current NSA dynamic is not that there aren't issues here to discuss and there isn't government excess to worry about, or that we all can't conjure Orwellian scenarios of government intrusion and a surveillance state that can't be mitigated. We can. But there's a framework. There's actually a legal framework. These things have been argued before. And the only thing that's different now, really, is that suddenly it's, instead of it being the people who were subject to it in the course of any number of variety of domestic law enforcement, suddenly it's us and our computers and our own fears. And so I think a lot of the discussion has become incredibly hyperbolic. And it's not actually rooted. I'm very distressed to hear of writers who are self-censoring right now. I think that's egregious, and I agree with the canary in the coal mine analogy. But I'm not sure, looking at it, that there's the evidentiary logic by which anyone should self-censor. And I think in some ways it's incumbent on writers to do their job and to write boldly and directly and to not fall sway to the idea that the government might do something that at this point, the allegations such as they are, and there are places where I'm very disturbed by what the government is doing, but they don't happen to be the things we're reading about in The Guardian or from Mr. Greenwald.
Let me follow up on one aspect of that. Compared with the other, you've had the most experience of anyone here in movies and TV, which has been historically an area where both self-censorship and imposed censorship has been more pronounced than in the print world. Have you seen any signs of self-censorship in the TV, movie world that are different from from the print world?
In I mean, I came out of journalism, and the battles I fought were usually with some desk sergeant in the Northern District who, you know, wanted to tell me that I couldn't have a police report. I mean, it was very, you know, very quotidian and not grandiose at all. But the entertainment industry is about money, and if they think something will make money, they'll find a way to justify it. And if it doesn't look like it's going to have a revenue stream, it doesn't matter how ennobled the idea is or how, you know, it's less about the controversy of something than it's, you know, I'm an apostate from an honest profession, and I make my living in one that is. So, you know, I've seen stories get shaped on the basis of, is this going to work in terms of gleaning an audience and maintaining a franchise? And those are disappointing choices, but I'm not sure they're, you know, it's a less political world than I would like it to be, actually.
I'd like to now ask Masha Gessen, who's worked extensively both in modern Russia and in the United States. We're talking about these pressures in the United States, which are indirect, economic, canary in the coal mine, et cetera. You're working in Russia now. What should we understand about the situation of free speech, of free inquiry in Russia, and also what can be done about it from outside groups like PEN or anybody else?
That's a lot of questions.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, you can just give whatever story you would like.
So my story would be, I have a little country house outside of Moscow, and there's a repairman that's been coming to the house for years. He sort of came on one job and then became a permanent fixture. So a few years ago, he's fixing something upstairs, and suddenly I see him running downstairs in a panic. He says, "What do you do? What do you do for a living?" I said, "I'm a journalist." He said, "Ah, okay." What happened, as it turns out, is that he'd found a bug behind the dresser. And for a second, he was terrified that I was some sort of high-powered business person, mafioso type, and he was in danger. But it is perfectly normal for a journalist to have a bug behind the dresser in their bedroom. So he immediately relaxed. I examined the bug, and the battery was expired. But for more years than I care to say, I've been living with the knowledge that all of my phone conversations are tapped, that I've been told, I haven't seen evidence of this, but I've been threatened with having videotapes made in my apartment released. So I assume there are video cameras in their apartment. I am quite certain that my email is monitored. I know that anything I blog about is monitored, whether it's supposed to be for private view or not, which actually in a lot of ways has kept me honest. It's I just know that everything I say and everything I do is known. And I don't do anything that I don't mean to do, and I don't say anything that I don't mean to say, which I think is a pretty good policy for writers in general.
I agree. And so we'll come back. We're going to end up on how the world can affect societies like Russia and China and all the rest. Let me turn now to Azar Nafisi. You have been, you've been in part of American society and American letters in recent years, but you're deeply connected, of course, to a society in the middle of figuring out how free expression will work. How should we understand these issues as they affect Iran's development now?
Well, one story that I had was in fact about writing when I was the first book I wrote was in fact on Vladimir Nabokov. And what I wanted to do was to make it not a book of literary criticism. I wanted to talk about how at different times in my life, reading him has changed my perspective on that life, and how the reality that I was facing at that time changed my perspective on his works. And as soon as I started, and my students were in love with him. I just don't know why, but invitation to a beheading drove them absolutely crazy, and they wanted to read more. So then, as soon as I started writing, if I wanted to write that book the way I wanted to, the first reality, I wanted the first paragraph to be, the first book I read by Nabokov was Ada, and my boyfriend Ted gave it to me, and he wrote on the flyleaf, "To Azar, my love, Ted." And I couldn't do that because the censorship was not just about politics. In fact, at certain times, you could speak about politics. You could criticize. But I mentioned in my book Living in Iran is like the month of April, a lot of showers and then a bit of sunshine and then showers again. So during that bit of sunshine, you could do certain things. But the point that I realized, and I think it applies to my experiences in the United States, was that these rights we call human rights or individual rights are not just simply political. That our political rights arise out of our right to exist. That for me, to be a woman, to be a writer, to be a defender of human rights, to be who I am, was an existential right. And that this system was sort of not letting me be. So it is very strange, I think Havel talks about it as well, that you try more and more to be yourself, you know, whatever that self is, which is constantly changing. And that is how I feel about the freedom of expression. That for me, whether I live in the United States or whether I live in Islamic Republic of Iran, it is an existential right. And may I say one more thing? I don't want to, you can cut me and tell me to shut up. I'm used to being told that. I just wanted to bring another quote from Nabokov. He says, readers are born free and they ought to remain free. And this debate today is not just about NSA. I think there's a far deeper question here, and it is the question of writers and readers. Because whenever the rights of writers are curtailed, the right of millions, billions of readers is taken away from them to read the way they want to read what they want to. And the worst threat to a society, especially to a democratic society, is not the brutalities that Iran or China or former Soviet Union implement. It is indifference. It is what Bellow used to call sleeping consciousness. And once we are indifferent towards our writers and towards the act of writing and towards imagination and towards what happens to that aspect of it, I think we open the doors for surveillance, among other things. And readers should not be indifferent. This is not just about us. And I agree with you, David, about the writers. The more we're surveyed, the more we should write. And that's what PEN is here for, to defend our rights.
And I wonder if I could turn back to an implication of what Yale Doctorow was saying to begin with. You were describing earlier, saying that the writers are the canaries in the mine shaft. They have reasons to be worried. David Simon was saying he thought we might be overreacting to some of this news. Masha Gessen was saying the more she's surveilled, the more honest she feels. Azar Nafisi was saying we're becoming, more ourselves. Are the results of this PEN survey, are they too alarmist? What would the case? What's the case you would make for the most genuine causes for alarm?
Well, I think that there are all sorts of ways to fight this as a writer, and one of them is going on and writing as you would ordinarily, and sending your emails and doing your research and so on. I was thinking of by way of example, the 1950s when writers were blacklisted in Hollywood and turned to evasive measures to get their work done by writing under pseudonyms or having what they call fronts to pretend to write, present their scripts while the true authors remained anonymous. I'm not aware from this survey that the people who were alarmed and said they're censoring themselves will not find evasive means of proceeding. I know that in terribly autocratic societies, writers do get by writing allegorically or metaphorically, but in ways to deceive the censors. But the point is that the enormous systematic technology of internet data mining is something that no one has been faced with before, and compared to which previous acts of censorship and imprisoning of writers and putting them on trial and so on are no necessarily illuminating an example. The man named Jaron Lanier, who's a very astute commentator on all these things, said there are two ways to deal with this. One is to regulate the act of the NSA and all the aggregating servers who are somehow partners in this. And the other way is to make everything transparent. His remark is to say transparency means nothing if you don't have the computer power to analyze the data. And as far as regulation goes, everyone will ignore the regulations, as police departments tend to do in all righteousness. So his idea, which is an interesting one, is that information be monetized, and that if anyone wants to use your information, they've got to pay you. I don't know how practical that is. I can see the government going absolutely broke paying everyone, but it's kind of
a stimulus program.
I like getting paid.
It's kind of this sort of thing that Google should be alarmed at too, that idea. But and I will say about Google, for all their generosity and their bravery in China, that their supporting this particular event might not be simply idealistic, but because if the NSA gets a really bad rep around the world, countries are going to use their own servers and their own search engines and isolate, not use the American Yahoo and Google and so on.
Right, that's already quite a significant trade problem for U.S.-based internet companies. And it is a connection to something I wanted to ask all of you about. If we are talking about Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Burma, we see fairly heavy political limits on free speech. Is it right to think that in the United States there are these technological problems, but the real challenges to free speech are economic more than, you were saying Hollywood is mainly driven by economics.
I think there's a real, I actually think there's a real interesting issue and a real essential issue of, the hard part of democracy is you often have competing legitimate goals. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression, a situation in which nobody is feeling a chill because of government surveillance of ideas is a fundamental of a free society and to be cherished in every sense. And then there are other goals which are entirely legitimate, which is to say law enforcement and counterterror and these other things. Now, if these things are, if they have a societal benefit, the problem I have in the way that the discussion has proceeded is that we seem to be saying for the first time in our own legal history and social history and political history that we've created something that has such scope. We've created a technology that is so vast and has the potential for something that's so Orwellian that even we can't lift it. That our levers of democracy and of self-governance now are ineffective for being able to police ourselves and for able to, to establish the legitimacy of free thought and free speech while at the same time allowing a technology that does have some legitimate asset value to to intelligence agencies and to law enforcement to be used, when it is for a societal good. And we've never done that with any technology. There's no law enforcement technology ever. And if you think that this is unique in its vast implications for misuse, at the same time that we were doing what I would regard as a little bit of the headless chicken over the NSA revelations and how they were first presented to us, the Supreme Court came down with a decision that said even for minor arrests and not for conviction, the law enforcement community can maintain a database of DNA of all Americans that are caught up in any kind of situation. They had jaywalking, whatever, public drunkenness, whatever. If you're locked up, your DNA is going to go into a government repository. Well, the history for that is legitimate. I mean, same thing with they already do it with your fingerprints, and that's a unique identifier. But this stuff is the potential for the misuse of such an asset is profound. And yet, nobody is suggesting, certainly not the high court of the land, and certainly nobody in government, that law enforcement should not have the asset of DNA, or that they should eschew DNA as a legal asset. That one passed so quietly and without any discussion on the op-ed pages or anywhere. And ultimately, this is my concern: is that I have real concerns about the FISA court and the sort of concrete secrecy in which we're supposed to balance these two competing issues. That I would love to see discussed. That's where I would love to see real reform. And instead, what I fear is becoming the essence here is that everyone is looking upon this as being a very simple equation of we don't need to do this, and it has no value. It has no legitimate value to law enforcement or to counterterrorism, and it does.
I never said that.
No.
The internet has immense possibilities of verge on genius. Depends on how it's used. The fact is that if not for what's his name, Snowden, we wouldn't even know about this.
That's right.
That's dangerous. There's a metaphysical quality to all of this, that it's not just politics involved. It's the way human beings ought to be perceived and understood. And if you break them down into their predilections, what they buy, what they see, what their medical records and so on, and you put that in a big data bank, what does that do to our idea of what it means to be human? This is not a political thought. This is an idea of real transformation. We're not talking about a game change here. We're talking about a league change, that everything will be different. And it could be scary, but it seems to me this is a kind of healthy discussion, not to discount the value of law enforcement and DNAs, but to see that there's something possibly perfidious going on if it's allowed to continue as it has.
Possibly perfidious.
Yes, and it's not simply law enforcement benefits. Probably many of us use our handheld maps to get here, which depend on knowing where we are every instant and having ubiquitous maps.
To revisit the DNA, it's that technology has managed to prove as many people innocent in recent years as
cure diseases and all the rest.
I guess what I'm concerned about, really concerned about, is the places where you would really want to see society wrestle with this and have the fights that are necessary to incorporate increasing technological advancement and at the same time preserve civil liberties. They're not happening. You know, look at the inertia in Congress over any attempt or any legislative effort to revise the FISA court, which is actually something that Obama finally conceded. I fully agree that what Snowden has given us is a window to have discussions like this. But I'll give you another example. The place where there was an actual affront, in my opinion, as opposed to a possibly perfidious scenario, but a place where this kind of data mining has been used in domestic law enforcement so that it's not about counterterror, and it actually is very disturbing to me, is something that has nothing to do with Mr. Greenwald or The Guardian. It was Reuters in August revealed the SOD program, which some of this data mining was being shipped over to the DEA, and they were then reconstructing probable cause and making cases in domestic law enforcement using this material. It's legal, but that's that mission creep that I agree is terrifying. So why not but that story passed in August with nary a whimper. I mean, nobody's talking about SOD. They're talking about, it's not about some drug dealer in Texas. We don't care about him. Where it's actually being applied, where the rubber's hitting the road, we're not paying attention. We're worried about us and our computer, and are they going to find out about me and this? And it's very. I actually think that this is the hard job of governance, and that's not being done now because we're sort of lost in these scenarios of what could happen.
So we can view this discussion as a start. Let me ask Masha Gessen, you live in a society that at many times has been viewed as sort of the extreme of the totalitarian state, where there's an attempt to know everything about everybody and use it. what is the perspective you can bring from knowing Russia the way you do to our discussions here in the U.S. about the limits of surveillance and non-surveillance?
You know, again, I'm going to be to sound like somebody who just loves being surveilled, which is not true. But I don't think surveillance is the problem. You know, I think the problem is if we can get a little bit more sort of existential about it, is the disruption of reality that happens when you're being surveilled, but not only when you're being surveilled. And I think that the digital strategies and technologies that concern me most are the ones that disrupt our realities. The most basic level is, you know, like when my computer disappears, which is somewhat digital, but it disappears from my locked car, and I turn the house upside down because I'm sure it was just here, you know, that I took it with me when I left the house, and it's disappeared. Or a book disappears, or, you know, I find something in my sock drawer that doesn't belong there. But it's also happening in the vast digital space. I'll give you an example. There's a Russian culture website that is trying to have a vote on who the most influential public intellectuals in Russia are. And the vote is being, basically, it's been fixed by paid pro-Kremlin users. So if you charted the way that the vote is turning out, first of all, nobody's coming out the winner because they've dispersed the votes. Second of all, you see somebody who's in the very far right, pro-Kremlin sort of, and can't really be called a public intellectual, who's sort of thrown in there as a disruption, getting as many votes as somebody who you would consider one of the authorities for the target audience of this website. So here's a very, very simple, not terribly creative sort of consensus building exercise this intellectual community is having, which is let's talk about who the authorities are for our community, and all of a sudden it's being disrupted by people who are coming in, who are paid to use their computers in this way. It was just one of many, many, many examples that skew reality, that reframe debate, and that make us crazy, basically, as crazy as, you know, finding something in your sock drawer makes you.
So let me ask one other international perspective from Azar Nafisi. As you see societies, notably Iranian, which are struggling towards a freer expression, which they don't have now, do you imagine the balance they're going to set is going to be worse, better, or the same than the one we're trying to set here? The balance as they mature, do you think there's going to be any better situation there?
Any better situation than we have over here?
Right.
I genuinely, honestly don't know. I would love for anywhere to be better than here, because then, you know, the world is a very good place, you know. But what I think is that one of the things that a society like Iran does, it reminds us of certain things about which we're very complacent. And that is something that has bothered me over there. And I'm not saying this as something that is positive about totalitarian or dictatorships, societies or dictatorships, where everything is very intense. I mean, you know, Popeye in Iran, olive oil is censored because she's a loose woman, and you didn't even know it. So you know, even watching Popeye becomes something intense. It's a subject of discussion. It is, and Iranians, like Eastern Europeans or like people in Soviet Union, use these absurdities in order to both live and at the same time, you know, to live with such absurdities is terrible. So the internet is very intense. So when the uprising in 2009, the Green Revolution happened, people were resorting to the Twitter and using their mobiles to let the world know. So over there, everything here that is more complex, more hidden, more evasive, over there is more naked. Like what I felt when I was in Iran, I remember when I was leaving Iran, my mother kept telling me, tell him. And that was what everybody wanted you to do, to tell people that we live here, and you need this voice, and sometimes because you don't have that voice, you crave it. Over here, we don't need, even the writers who feel threatened and, you know, who don't want to write right now, there is not, this situation doesn't exist. And I think what we need is more debate around these issues. What worries me, you know, we were talking about Greenwald and Snowden, and David brought some questions that I hadn't thought about much. What David brings about is not very sexy, right? I mean, it is not something that O'Reilly and MSNBC and CNN can get their teeth into. So they are evaded. They are not talked about. What is talked about is Snowden in that Moscow you know, airport, sitting there, what will he do now? And that is what bothers me, that things that need thought, that things that need a little effort, that things that seem dull but are part of democracy, part of the routine of everyday life, are not being discussed. And as we can see from this discussion, they can be very sexy and exciting if we make it, you know.
With the right lineup.
Yeah.
So we have a few minutes before I'm going to involve the audience in questions. I'm going to give you a sort of preview of the three things I'm going to try to cover in the few minutes we have. One of them is going to be politics, what the political discussion of these issues is like and why it's hard to engage. Second, journalism, whether changes in the production of information are improving or deteriorating the way we discuss these issues. And then finally, internationally, what people in a country like this can do, what kind of leverage they can exercise in China and Russia and Iran or elsewhere. Let me first start with politics. Most of President Obama's critics would assert that he is too far left. The area in which he is certainly not far left at all is national security type issues, where it's been under his administration. We've heard about these NSA programs, et cetera. Given that a two-term Democratic president who is reviled as a socialist by his opponents cannot grapple with this issue, how politically do you think the United States can engage these questions?
Well, the question is always to pit security against personal privacy. But privacy always loses when you do that. And I think the president and the administration have accepted that unbalanced either-or situation. But it's not just the administration, but I do have a question of why do the big companies like Google and Yahoo and Microsoft and Facebook, why do they save everything?
Because they can.
Because they can, and because it's profitable.
Has value.
And if they didn't save everything, maybe there are other ways to make money. But I think algorithm, who could ask for anything more? You know, it just depends on how exercised you're going to be. I happen to think that the seed is planted every time we do something, we cut into the Constitution, we're changing ourselves. We saw that with George Bush instituting torture and violating international treaties, which according to the Constitution are the law of the land. And every time you begin to snip away at the Constitution, the Chinese have a beautiful Constitution that the government totally ignores. And we don't want to be in that situation. We really don't. And I think it's better to even be alarmist and accuse the writers who claim that they are self-censoring. We can accuse them of cowardice. But nevertheless, there's this large thing out there that can be used in any way and has no precedent, even with DNA and
Does it have no precedent constitutionally?
well, no. The technology itself is so vast and total.
The potential for the Orwellian nightmare is profound, of course. But, you know, to give another technological comparison, and it makes my head hurt for the sheer terror of it. Every day we live with the presumption of nuclear weapons and a nuclear deterrent. And it's not just a threat to civil liberties, it's a threat to human existence. But it also, at this point, nationalism being what it is, and living in the world we live in and not in the world we'd like to live in, if at some point we looked at it and said, this technology is too big for us to legislate or lift or self-govern, so let's just get rid of it. I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, what is the end game for this NSA stuff? Which is, I'm really interested in this. What is the, can we do without an intelligence community? Can we do it without intelligence gathering in the real world? Can we? Let's speak to what the end game is that we want, and then let's work back from there. Because the other thing that's happened with this whole discussion is, we began with 6 months ago with the fear that Americans were now being vulnerable to being spied on by their government, and that our civil liberties, our basic civil liberties, our basic right to privacy was vulnerable. And then I waited, like everybody waited, for that moment when it would be revealed that the government was actually endeavoring to spy on individual Americans or to spy on political opponents or do the things that we're speaking about in other cultures and other countries that have become endemic. And that smoking gun couldn't be delivered because it's not really there, not from this NSA data mining. Instead, it shifted to, well, now let me tell you about the intelligence community spying on world leaders around the world, which is a different dynamic, and it also happens to be the job description of the intelligence community. Yeah. And from a personal perspective, I don't want less intel. I want my government to do a really good job of spying on everybody else's government, and I want every other government to do a really good job of spying on my government. Because the thing I fear most, the miscalculation I fear, is August 1914 or October 1962, the idea of world leaders not sensing what the options are and where the natural opposition is going to go. I don't want somebody stumbling into, and if you think that's not a real world reality, look at what's happening in the Sea off China, where 3 countries, one of them our ally, one of them are not our adversary but our competitor, China and Japan, we're arguing over air rights. And we're flying B-52s, and they're challenging, we're going to challenge this plane. You know what? I hope they're spying like hell on all of it. I hope everybody knows exactly.
Right, and the problem there is the Chinese military knows too little about the U.S.
Right. Well, if you want to lionize what Snowden and Greenwald have done, I think you have to separate the two issues. I think Snowden would be in a lot more, I'd be a lot more comfortable if he'd restrained himself to the moral position of I think you guys are violating the Constitution. You know, a soldier when he pledges when he takes the oath as a soldier or a Marine, it's to the Constitution. And if Snowden, as a cleared employee of the intelligence community, had said, I felt this was unconstitutional. You could argue about that. I wouldn't entirely disagree with him. I would entirely disagree with him, but it's a legitimate position for him to have taken morally and said, this is about something I think is unconstitutional. But when he's telling China what we're doing and assuring us that we're spying, you know, they're spying on us, we're spying on them, you know, as the French foreign minister said, everybody's listening to everybody. And I hope so. So ultimately, at some point, this thing...
As long as they don't listen to us.
Well, there was the rumor that they're listening to ordinary Europeans. That one fell apart too a couple weeks ago. So ultimately, there's a couple of things that are traveling on different tracks here that have different moral equations. And the discussion has gotten down to the NSA is bad, and everything they do is not part of what we want America to be. But gentlemen really do read each other's mail. Stimson, when he said that, was wrong. He said it in 1929 as Secretary of War. A few years later, he was dealing with Pearl Harbor. So ultimately, this is the world we live in, not the world we want it to be. And I want to know what the end game is. I really would like to hear people explain it.
So would anybody like to address, I wrote an article, a cover story 7 years ago in the Atlantic called Declaring Victory, about how we should declare an end to the war on terror, was trying to lay out the end game. But my fear is the ratchet of U.S. politics makes that very, very difficult to do. If any of you want to address directly what David Simon was saying, you can, but let's move to one other topic, which is part of our stated franchise here. In the U.S., we have free speech problems, which again are technological potentials, economic pressures, and all the rest. In Iran, it's different. It's Russia, and it's different. In China, it's different. What can writers in the freest society, the United States, do to advance the cause of people who are in jail, who can't receive their Nobel Peace Prize, who can't get their books published? What is the both the obligation and the potential for writers like you, groups like this?
Well, PEN has been involved in this sort of thing for many, many years, where there's an obvious error or injustice as applied to a writer. PEN has sent letters and done demonstrations. We did it for the Chinese chap who was put in jail. We've been doing this for years, and sometimes it works. Sometimes the publicity of a writers' organization saying, please, you've got to let this guy out, and so on and so forth. It sometimes works. And PEN has an annual prize for a brave writer under one of these regimes who has fought and been jailed and whose pen has managed to get out of jail and who comes over and takes an award. So this is an active organization, and it does deal with specific cases of intimidation and imprisonment and worse applied to writers all over the world. There's another wonderful group called the Committee to Protect Journalists. I mean, the numbers of journalists who've been killed, as you well know, all in these countries, has created this organization that publicizes it and tries to see that it doesn't happen again.
Could you just address that question in general and in specific for Iran, as it's struggling to rejoin the modern world? How can the outside world help?
Well, you know, the Iranian people have rejoined the modern world a long time ago. It is the regime that has certain problems with it, and I foresee that it will have certain problems. But I don't want to elaborate because you said it so well. People feel very lonely when they don't think that the world knows about how they live. And one of the best things that PEN and organizations such as PEN, and PEN is very unique in many ways, has done is to let Iranians, especially Iranian journalists and Iranian writers, know that they're not alone. And some of the governments, I know this is true of Iran, they try to publicize that the more you talk about these writers in the West, the more in danger they are.
Right.
We have seen time and time again that this is exact reverse. That's as soon as your cause is picked up, you have a chance because the world is watching. And I think one other thing PEN has done, and I very much appreciate, is through defending these people, and I know several cases of people very intimately in Iran whom they have defended, is that they make American people aware of what is happening in those countries, and they make American people aware of not how different Iranians are from them, but how alike they are, how much they share, and for that I'm very appreciative.
My observation in China is that often the government's back does get up if there's foreign recognition of some writer. How about the Russian perspective? In what ways can world opinion, PEN, American groups be of use in the Russian dynamic?
I agree with every word you said. And so the most important thing is, yes, to let them know that the world is watching. I know that I'm much safer and have been safe, relatively safe in Russia, because my books have been published in many languages and because they know that it will be bad publicity. People who are not as well known are in much more danger, and they are the ones who end up going to jail. They're the ones who end up getting attacked. They're the ones who end up getting killed. I know that, or I'm pretty sure that the reason that the members of Pussy Riot who are still in jail are alive today is because the eyes of the world are on them, and the Russian government knows this. And Penn actually played a huge role in that with a very large campaign. I think if I were going to change anything in this approach, I'd say getting involved earlier is always much more useful. Once people are in the machine, once they're being processed, once the paperwork has started, there's very little chance of getting people out of jail. You can still keep them alive by looking at them, but you can't get them out of jail. So cases like the very recent, last week, a blogger in Rostov-on-the-Don was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison for felony libel of a government official for calling her a mousy person. Yeah, funny. If we had known about this earlier, if it had gotten any international attention, and it hasn't gotten any, I think he might have gotten a suspended sentence or not been tried at all. So that's very important. And one last thing is I am dreading what happens after the Olympics. Because right now we're talking about the anti-gay laws and the restrictions on free speech and all the horrible stuff that is happening in Russia. All of this stuff, I mean, the crackdown that we face today, and we do face a crackdown, will seem like child's play at the end of February. And the media will have stopped writing about it. Russia will be off the radar as of February 23rd or whatever. Yeah, I think it's February 23rd that the Olympics end. And organizations like Penn can really do something about that.
And this is where internet can do a lot.
Yes.
Internet did a lot for Iran, and I think that they can do a lot for them.
Before asking for David Simon on this, I'll give you an Olympic anecdote from China. During the Beijing Olympics of 2008, the Foreign Ministry very bravely proclaimed an authorized protest area for anybody who wanted to demonstrate during the Olympics. And then the Security Bureau arrested everybody who applied. So I think it wasn't a big master plan. It was just uncoordination. But yes, David, on the international role.
I would only affirm what everyone's saying. And in fact, this is the reason I'm a member of Penn for this programming.
Great. So we now have 15 minutes or so for questioning. Please raise your hand. Microphones will come to you. And when a microphone comes, please identify yourself and ask your question. Okay, a microphone. Let's see. Okay, yes, microphone here. And then I'll just call on sequentially on people with microphones. Yes.
My name is Joe Freeman. I'm an alumni of the Berkeley Free Speech Movement, which will be celebrating its 50th anniversary next year. And I wrote about it in my 10th book. The rules we rebelled against back in 1964 came out of, it wasn't called a war, but the effort to undermine communist subversion in this country. They crept in over a period of 30 years until what students could say on their own campuses subjected them to punishment. When the war on terrorism started 10 years ago, I saw history repeating itself. And the more I've read of U.S. history, the more I realize is this isn't even the second time this has happened. It's about the fourth or fifth time. Why do we keep repeating history? Why don't we learn from our mistakes?
Who would like to answer that? Anybody could answer at great length, but a concise answer from anyone on why we can't get out of these habits?
I'll just say one thing very quickly, which is the rules didn't change for the war on terror. That's inaccurate. The rules changed for the drug war. The drug war. What is going before the FISA court is Fourth Amendment logic that generations of administrations and Supreme Courts have affirmed, and ultimately it is the drug war where the rubber hits the road. And the reason that it happened and that we've gone where we've gone with the Fourth Amendment is we really don't give a damn about black and brown people. When it's our computer and ourselves and our own sense of our own, sort of middle class security, upper middle class, whatever, entitlement, all of a sudden there's a civil liberties issue. But for the last 30 years, it's been remarkably quiet. And all of this stuff has not only its antecedents, it has its roots in the drug war.
Did you want to answer that?
No, that's all right.
Yes, who has the next microphone? Yes. So microphone bearers, please go to the next people, and I'll call on you. Yes.
Hi, Hugh Grindstaff, and I think I might have a little bit of a different perspective. Have any of you ever been denied writing a book or writing a column in the U.S.? You haven't. We have free speech. What bothers me more is Google being able to accumulate so much information on us. Data mining, Google, how much you spend here or how much you spend there. Every time you turn on your computer and you log on, what are you getting now on your email? You're getting the same thing. So for me, as a person who has handled in the past things with NSA, the NSA doesn't bother me. It's the information that corporations can get on you and then use that to mold data that will, in a way, influence you, influence the way you spend, influence everything else. So,
So who would like to make analytically the case for being more upset about NSA data collection than Google, Yahoo, Facebook data collection?
Well, there's a corporate connection. They're on the same page, as we like to say. The NSA couldn't work without the intimidation or agreement of some of these companies. And their prior existence is to create wealth for themselves. And if that happens to suit the NSA by virtue of subpoenas or some other legal instrument, there's the connection right there. So you're right to be alarmed at the corporate uses of your information and your data. It is what we in the 60s used to call reification. They're turning people into pieces of information.
But finally, the power of the state does not lie behind Google, Yahoo, Facebook, et cetera, as it does
right.
with the NSA. So who is on this side of the room with a microphone? Yes. Sorry, is there, I can't see very well. Yes, the microphone is coming to the front row. Yes.
Hi. Hi. I'm Ross Lajeunesse with Google, and I just wanted to take an opportunity. No, I really wasn't going to interrupt the program because I'm here to listen, but I did want to set the record straight. And I think it's important when we talk about these issues to talk about them with specificity and to speak about facts. When Mr. Doctorow said, why does Google keep everything? I let that go. But the reality is we don't. And it is a real danger, I believe, to conflate the actions of a government that are not transparent, that undergo no review, with what something a company like Google does, which is, first of all, we're completely transparent about the data we collect about people. We give control to the users. You can use our services without signing in. You can use them anonymously. If you do choose to sign in, we then give you complete control over that data as well. You can erase it. You can tell us what you want us to know about you or not. And the most impressive thing I think we do is we actually give you a button where you can delete all that data at once or export it to a different service. So I did want to just address some of the issues that were brought up. And again, I wasn't going to interrupt the program, but I wanted us to know the facts.
Excuse me, when you decide what to dispense with and what to keep, what's the basis of those judgments?
The user decides what we keep or what we don't keep. We give our users complete control over your data because we believe it is your data. If you allow us to use it, we use it, and we're very clear about how we use it. We use it to give you better services, what we think are better services. And there's always the option of, as I said, of not using our services or using them anonymously or deleting the data or sending it to someone else.
Do you allow readers to be proactive? By that I mean, can they decide to initiate any of your use? Or is it a matter of hunting down these moments where Google, because this has been my experience, where Google informs you that they're going to use it in some new and varied way, and you have to negate Google's efforts?
They inform you, unlike Facebook.
What?
We do, David. We do tell our users, and you sign in when you use those services, or you choose not to sign in.
I have had to continually chase Google to find out, what was. I believe I was just told that if I had to opt out of a program where stuff I said online could be used in advertising, whether I wanted to or not, I was going to have to opt out of that. That's a rather cynical performance, don't you think? Shouldn't I have to opt into it, something that extraordinary?
When you sign in as a user, you opt into our full suite of services. You can use search, not signed in, and if you are signed in, you can do what I just said with your data.
How's about you let me use Google as a search engine, and if I want to participate in a program, you offer me the chance to participate and sign up for it, rather than sign out of it?
That's exactly what we do, David. You can use the Google search engine not signed in.
I'm going to declare the end of this topic right now. Sorry, unless you have, you may, yeah.
I know there are hosts,
Yes.
but
What's that little button you said you can dispense with every, what button is that?
I'll show it to you, Mr. Doctorow.
So I will declare my interest here. I'm not an employee of Google. I have a lot of friends there, and one of my sons now works at Google, I should say. But having worked with the company journalistically for much longer than I've had any personal involvement with it, I am impressed by their efforts to swing the balance in the way you say. They collect a lot of information. They're more careful about it than other companies I'm aware of for what it's worth. Is there a microphone back here? Yes.
Chris Walker at the National Endowment for Democracy. At the very outset of the discussion, James Fallows mentioned the technological challenge that had emerged in the States. And then during the conversation, David Simon focused on the competing interests and challenges that a democracy faces. I thought I would just ask for a reaction to a framing of this issue. This is an issue that was articulated very well by Evgeny Morozov in a Journal of Democracy article, where he pointed out you have the technological aspects of censorship, many of which are manifesting in the NSA debate. You also have the socio-political side of things, which embodies law enforcement standards and practices, the ability to hold powerful interests accountable, the state accountable. And I just wonder, if we set aside the technological side, if the panel agrees that the socio-political part of this has already deteriorated in the States to the point where it's irretrievable, because David Simon was implying this, that the U.S. system and presumably other democracies aren't capable of imposing some sort of checks and balances on the emerging challenges that are arising from this technological advance. So I'd be curious for thoughts on this.
I'm going to exercise my my prerogative of giving an actual answer myself, and then I'll turn to expert panelists.
China's a great example of having all of the dimensions that are so problematic.
It is. I will be very disturbed if at the end of his second term, President Obama has not reversed the ratchet on the security state apparatus, because if it's not going to happen in these circumstances, it's really hard for me to understand how it's going to happen. But what say you on whether we can deal democratically and culturally with reversing the ratchet?
It's going to be difficult. I think the answer is street demonstrations, massive objections.
We have our news lead.
Carrying flags, being reckless and raucous and difficult. I think part of the problem is that these NSA revelations have not really turned anyone on, particularly in this country. So it's a matter of informing people. I mean, you might go in the way of what David thinks is hysteria, which is my role here.
but so understated.
Yeah.
Or people involved in such organizations with this kind of sensitivity and worry could presumably organize more events like this, and there's another kind of thing happening in New York where everyone's going crazy to change the great New York Public Library. So committees have formed to object to this, and there are street demonstrations, and there are lobbyings, and there are attempts to involve lawyers to do cost analyses of things. There are all sorts of ways to begin to deal with these insurmountable problems, and they all involve peaceable protests and petitioning the government.
That is what I was, yeah, thank you. Because, no, that is what I was trying to say, that if we don't care, I don't know why we think that governments and corporations should care about us. I mean, we have to show some sort of initiative. We can't constantly grumble about our privacy while we are nonchalantly giving it all up, without knowing how or what we're giving up. All these things you were saying about Google, I had no idea about. And I go on Google every day, So I think that people should start caring about the values. People should understand that freedom of speech and freedom, like happiness, is elusive, that you constantly have to fight for it, and that this indifference is not doing any of us any good. And I'm not saying I agree with my political positions, but I'm saying that we need to care. And thank you for saying that.
So do you two join the call for demonstrations to the barricades?
I always like going to the barricades just to go.
Just for
It's one of my favorate places.
We need a national debate. We need a march on Washington for a national debate.
Go ahead.
No, it's okay.
Actually, I'm more concerned about the fact that I actually think that, pressed on this, as he is, because it is a real issue, and there are real concerns about privacy and civil rights, or civil liberties, rather. Obama said the right thing. He said, I'm willing to look at, and I think we should look at, reforming the hyper-secrecy of the FISA court. That is a court that is not a court in the American sense or in the English common law sense of what a court is. It's not adversarial. There's nobody speaking for privacy or for the citizens. There is no equivalent of a public defender arguing on behalf of or arguing in opposition. And tellingly, I would have assumed that the court was, quite a rubber stamp because it operates in secret, and these judges are, been chosen. And interestingly enough, there was the reveal of it got played the wrong way, but there was a reveal, I don't know if you remember it, of 5,000 errors that they were being called to account for by a FISA court judge, and they released this. And the way it got played in the media was, look at the NSA. Look at the NSA, making all these mistakes, gathering all this stuff they're not supposed to gather. But in truth, having covered innumerable wiretaps, domestic wiretaps, minimization is a legal logic that says, look, you're catching thousands of calls, in this case millions of pieces of metadata, and you're going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes that are genuinely honest and that you have no intention of capturing what you capture. So we, the judge overseeing the wiretap, want to know that you're doing your best to minimize and that you're destroying what you're not supposed to get. And in a single wiretap in Baltimore, you would see hundreds of mistakes that, in the course of minimization. Here you had 5,000 mistakes in something like 3.5 years. I was like, this is actually revealing not an NSA run amok. This is actually more oversight from that secret court than I even thought existed. Right. I looked at the story and said, you know what? This is better than I thought they'd do operating in secrecy. Not that I'm saying it's good enough and not that I'm comfortable with the secrecy. But Obama actually said, this is where the rubber hits the road. And the collective yawn from both parties in Congress, there isn't a piece of legislation going to address this.
He got supportive blog posts on the Atlantic site. What more can he want?
I mean,
so we have 1 more minute left here. If somebody has a 30-second question, who has the microphone? And we can have a 30-second. Yes.
Rachel Oswald. I'm a journalist and involved with press freedom issues at the National Press Club here in Washington. I'll try to make this brief. Playing devil's advocate, if I could get you to respond to this kind of half-formed theory. It seems to me that at the beginning, the American Revolution, civil liberties, particularly the Fourth Amendment, privacy, and the First Amendment really did matter to people. But at that time, society was much more violent. You were much more likely to die of violent causes. We enslaved vast swaths of the population. There was more domestic violence against women. Now, things are better. They're not perfect, but they're better. And I think part of that is due to the pacification of Americans. We have more trust in government. We have more trust in our neighbors, and maybe that allows us to acquiesce to this invasion of privacy, which we're not even aware of. Is that a trade-off to having a less violent society, that we're more allowing of people to know things about us, including the government?
I predict this is a question that will be discussed after we conclude here, but who would like to have a interim response?
Did you say a less violent society?
Americans are less likely today to die by the hands of violence of others than we were even 50 years ago. Like, today you are less likely to die of homicide than you were 50 years ago, let alone 200 years ago.
So the mark of a great discussion is that you want to continue it afterwards. So I think we now have our marker for a great discussion. So please join me in thanking the superb panel for beginning our discussion. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.